25. Day after day they were now waiting for fresh news, not merely that Scipio was dead, but even that he was buried. But none came as the groundless rumors began to dissipate. The search began for those responsible for first putting them out. One by one men began to fall back, hoping they could appear to have been gullible in accepting such a story, rather than have been its inventor. The leaders, now isolated, began to shudder at the thought of their own insignia, and of the real and duly appointed power that would soon turn upon them, replacing the spurious authority they were wielding. And so the mutiny began to lose momentum. Then reliable informants reported first that Scipio was alive, and presently even that he was in good health, and 7 military tribunes came on the scene personally sent there by Scipio. There were ruffled feelings when the tribunes first arrived, but they were soon smoothed out when the officers began to placate personal acquaintances they met with conciliatory language. Then they first of all made the rounds of the tents, and later appeared in the headquarters and at the general's tent, where they had seen groups of men engaged in conversation. They would address the men, and instead of reproaching them for what they had done, would ask them what had been responsible for the sudden outbreak of madness and sedition. The grievance usually adduced was that they had not been paid on time, and they also brought up the atrocity committed by the inhabitants of the Illiturgi. After 2 generals and 2 armies had been wiped out, they said, it was thanks to their courage that the Roman name had been defended at that time, and a hold maintained on the province. Yet while the men of Illiturgi had received the punishment they deserved for their crime, there was nobody to recompense the Roman soldiers for the service they had rendered. The tribunes replied that in lodging such grievances the men were asking only for what was their due, and that they would relay them to the commander. They were happy that the problem was not more severe or more difficult to remedy, they said, and, thanks to the blessing of the gods, Publius Scipio and the Republic could now show their gratitude. While Scipio was well acquainted with warfare, he had no experience of mutinous outbursts. The situation had him worried. He wished to avoid excess, whether it be in tolerating the army's insubordination or in punishing it. For the moment he decided to continue with the lenient course on which he had embarked, and by dispatching collection agents around the tributary states, he raised the prospect of early payment for the men. He also straightway issued an edict for them to come together in New Carthage for their pay, in units or in a body, whichever they preferred. The mutiny was now flagging away anyway, but the sudden arrival of peace amongst the recalcitrant Spaniards brought it to a standstill, for Mandonius and Indibilius had, when brought the news that Scipio was alive, abandoned their enterprise and returned to their territory. Now the mutineers had no one, whether citizen or foreigner, with whom to share their insane program. As they examined every possible course of action, they found the only chance left to them after the villainous schemes, and that a not very safe one, was to submit to the commander's justifiable wrath or to his mercy, which they felt was not beyond the bounds of hope. Scipio had pardoned even enemies with whom he had fought with the sword. they told themselves, and their mutiny had struck no blow and shed no blood. It had not itself been brutal, and did not merit a brutal punishment. So glib are human beings when it comes to playing down their own wrongdoings. There was some indecision over whether they should go for their pay as individual cohorts or as a body, and the scale tipped towards going as a body, which they felt the safer option. (26) On the very days the mutineers were considering all this, there was a meeting devoted to them at New Carthage. Their opinions were divided on whether punishment should be restricted to the ringleaders of the mutiny, who were no more than 35 in number, or whether more should be disciplined in order to penalize what was less a mutiny than an outright rebellion that set a terrible precedent. The more lenient view won the day, namely that punishment be applied to the source of the offense. It was felt that a reprimand would suffice for the majority. The meeting had adjourned, and to make it look as if it had been the business discussed, the army at New Carthage was given notice of an expedition against Mandonius and Indibilis, and instructed to prepare several days' food rations. The 7 tribunes, who had earlier gone to Socro to quell the mutiny, were now sent to meet the army, and each was furnished with the names of 5 of the ringleaders of the mutiny. They were each to employ appropriate third parties to invite his 5 to reception, with a friendly expression and words of welcome, and when the men were drowsy with wine, they were to put them in irons. The mutinous troops were not far distant from New Carthage, when they learned from men they met on the road that the entire army, under the command of Marcus Silanus, was setting out against the Lasactani the following day. This not only freed them from all the dread that lurked at the back of their minds, but also brought them great satisfaction, because now they would have the commander on his own and not themselves be in his power. Towards sunset they entered the city and saw the other army making all preparations for the march. They were welcomed with some well-chosen words. Their arrival was propitious and timely for the commander-in-chief, they were told, because they had come just before the other army was setting out. With that, they went off to eat and relax. The ringleaders of the insurrection were taken away by the selected men to be entertained, and were then, with no trouble at all, arrested and clapped in irons by the tribunes. At the time of the 4th watch, the baggage train of the army that was ostensibly marching off began to move out. At dawn the troops set off, but the column was brought to a halt at the gate, and guards were then set around all other city gates to prevent anyone leaving. Next, the men who had arrived the previous day were summoned to a meeting, and they swiftly converged in a threatening manner on the commander's dais in the forum, intending to intimidate him with their noisy interjections. The moment that the commander climbed the dais, the soldiers were brought back from the gates, and they stood in a circle behind the unarmed assembly. With that, all the men's truculence vanished, and as they later admitted, nothing gave them such fright as the unexpected vigor and healthy complexion of the commander, whom they had expected to behold on his sickbed, and a look on his face they claimed they did not remember seeing even in battle. For a while, Scipio sat in silence, until word came that the ringleaders of the mutiny had been brought into the ground, and that all was ready. 27. Then, when silence fell at the herald's signal, he spoke as follows. Never did I think I would find myself lost for words with which to address my army. That is not because I have ever made words rather than actions the subject of my training, but because, having been brought up in the camp almost from childhood, I was familiar with the soldier's character. But you are different, and I am at a loss for ideas and words on how to address you, and I do not even know the title to use. Shall I call you citizens, when you have abandoned your country? Or soldiers, when you have turned your back on authority and the auspices, and broken the sacred obligations of your oath? Or enemies? I recognize the features, faces, dress, and bearing on my fellow citizens, but I see the actions, words, design, and temperament of an enemy. For how are your wishes and aspirations different from those of the Ilbergetes and Lasitani? And yet the leaders of their frenzy, the men they chose to follow, Mandonius and Indibilis, were of royal stock. You bestowed the auspices and supreme authority on the Umbrian Atreus and the Calanian Albius. Tell me, men, that you were not all involved in that, or that you did not all want to be involved, that it was just a few who were guilty of such delusion and lunacy. I shall willingly accept your denial of guilt, for such were the transgressions that if the whole army was involved, atonement could be made only with enormous sacrifice. It is with reluctance that I touch on these matters, which are like wounds, but unless they are touched and handled, they cannot be healed. Frankly, after the Carthaginians were driven from Spain, I could not believe that there was anyone in the whole province who hated the fact that I was alive. Such had been my conduct vis-a-vis my enemies as well as my friends. How wrong was I? How wrong was I? Look at it. In my own camp, the report of my death was not only readily believed, but eagerly awaited. It is not that I have any wish to believe the guilt lies with all of you. In fact, if I believed my whole army had wished me dead, I would die here before your eyes right now, and would take no pleasure in a life that was offensive to my fellow citizens and my men. No, the fact is that, like the sea, every crowd is naturally motionless. In you, too, there is the calm, or there are tempests, according to the motion produced by the squalls and breezes. And the responsibility and cause of all your wild behavior lies with the ringleaders. You caught the insanity from them, and it seems to me that not even today are you aware of how far your madness went, on the extent of the outrage you dared to inflict on me, your country, your parents and children, and on the gods who witnessed your oath. You seem unaware of how far you violated the auspices under which you fought, the military traditions and discipline of your forebears, and the majesty of your supreme command. About myself I say nothing. Let us attribute your belief in my death to thoughtlessness, rather than a wish for it to be so, and let us assume I am the sort of man whose command and army could understandably find unsupportable. But your country, what had she done to deserve your betraying her by making common cause with Mandonius and Indibilis? What had the Roman people done to make you remove imperium from duly elected tribunes, and confer it on private individuals? And not satisfied with merely having those men as your tribunes, how could you, a Roman army, then award the faces of your commander-in-chief to such men as had never even had a slave to give orders to, Albius and Atreus billeted themselves in the general's tent. It was at their quarters that the trumpet was sounded. It was they who were asked for the password, and they sat on the dais of Publius Scipio. A lictor attended on them. People were moved aside as they went forward, and the fasces and axes were carried before them. Stones falling as rain, thunderbolts hurled from heaven, animals producing bizarre offspring, such are the things you consider to be portents. But this is a portent that can be expiated by no sacrificial victims and by no supplicatory offerings, only by the blood of the men who dared to commit such a heinous crime. 28. No crime has rational motivation, and yet I would like to know, as far as one can in the case of a fiendish act, what you were thinking and what your plan was. A legion that was once dispatched to garrison Rhegium committed the crime of killing the foremost members of the community and holding that wealthy city in its control for a 10-year period. For that offense, the entire region, 4,000 men, were beheaded in the Forum in Rome. They followed the lead of a military tribune, Decimus Vibelius, not someone who was practically a camp follower, an Umbrian called Atreus, whose very name is a bad omen. And in addition, they did not throw in their lot with Pyrrhus, or with Samnites or the Lucanians. You made common cause with Mandonius and Indibilis, and were intending to join forces with them. Those legionaries were going to keep Rhegium as their permanent home, just as the Campanians kept Capua, after taking it from its Etruscan inhabitants of old, and as the Mamertines kept Messana in Sicily. And they had no intention of launching an attack on the Roman people or allies of the Roman people. Were you going to keep Sucro as your place of residence? If I had left you in the town, when on the completion of my mission, I was retiring as your commander-in-chief, you would have been justified in protesting to gods and men that you were not returning to your wives and children. But let us suppose that you had driven from your minds all memory of these, along with the memory of your country and of me. I still want to follow the scenario for this criminal, though not absolutely crazy scheme. Did you really intend to wrest the province of Spain from the Roman people, and to attempt that when I was still alive, and the rest of the army still in one piece, the army with which I captured New Carthage in a single day, and with which I routed and put to flight, and then chased out of Spain 4 commanders and 4 armies of Carthage? And your numbers being only 8,000, all of you of inferior quality to Albius and Atreus, under whose authority you put yourselves. I pass over my reputation and leave it entirely out of the question, assuming the only wrong I was done by you was to have you two I pass over my reputation and leave it entirely out of the question, assuming the only wrong I was done by you was to have you too readily believe me dead. Now suppose I had in fact died. Was the Republic going to expire along with me? Was the empire of the Roman people going to fall with me? I pray that Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, not allow this to happen. I pray that the city that was founded to live forever, founded with favorable auspices, and the support of the gods not be only as long-lived as the frail and mortal body of mine. Flaminius, Paulus, Gracchus, Postumius, Albinus, Marcus, Marcellus, Titus, Quintius, Crispinus, Gnaeus Fulvius, my own family members, the Scipios. All those fine commanders have been taken from us in this one war. And yet the Roman people lives on, and will continue to live on, though 1,000 others die, whether by the sword or from disease. Would the Republic then have been buried at the funeral of a single individual, me? Indeed, you yourselves, when the two commanders, my father and my uncle, were killed here in Spain, you still selected Septimus Marcius as your leader against the Carthaginians, elated by their recent victory. And I am talking as if, in the event of my death, the Spanish provinces would have been without a commander. Marcus Silanus was sent out with me to this sphere of command, with the same authority and the same powers, and my brother Lucius Scipio and Gaius Laelius were my legates. Would these men have failed to champion the majesty of our empire? Could one army have been compared with the other, or one army's officers with the others? Could there have been any comparison in terms of their status or the justice of their cause? And had you been superior in all these respects, would you have shouldered arms against your country and against your own citizens? Would you have wanted to see Africa ascendant over Italy, and Carthage over the city of Rome? What wrong did your country do to deserve that? 29. An unjust conviction leading to a miserable and undeserved exile once drove Coriolanus to launch an attack on his country, but his individual sense of duty to his family called him away from a crime against the state. In your case, what was the resentment or anger that spurred you on? Your pay was given to you a few days late because your commander was ill. Was that a sufficient reason to declaring war on your country, for abandoning the Roman people to join the Elergates, for regarding nothing in the divine or human sphere as inviolably sacred? You were evidently in the grip of insanity, men, and the disease that assailed my body was no more severe than that which assailed your minds. I shudder at the thought of what men believed, what their hopes and aspirations were. Let forgetfulness sweep it all away and obliterate it, if such is possible. Failing that, let there be some veil of silence over it. I would not deny that what I have just said may well have struck you harsh and cruel, but how much more cruel do you think your actions were than my words? You think it fair that I should put up with what you have done? So will you not even resign yourselves to being told all about it? But even those actions of yours will not be cast up at you any more. I just hope that you can forget them as easily as I shall. So as far as you, as a whole, are concerned, I shall have satisfaction enough, and more than enough, if you regret your wrongdoing. The Calenian Albius, and the Umbrian Atreus, and all of the other ringleaders of this foul insurrection, they shall pay for their acts with their blood. So far from causing you pain, the sight of their punishment should bring you joy, if your sanity has returned. They have done nobody greater harm or injury than they have you. He had barely finished speaking, when, as had been arranged, his audience's eyes and ears were subjected to all manner of horror. The troops, that had cordoned off the assembly banged on their shields with their swords. The crier's voice was heard calling out the names of the men who had been found guilty in the council meeting, and these were dragged naked into the midst of the gathering, where all the instruments of punishment were brought into view. The men were tied to stakes, flogged, and beheaded. So paralyzed with fear were all those present that there was not even a moan to be heard, much less any voice raised in protest against the harshness of the punishment. Then all the corpses were dragged from their midst, the ground was cleansed, and the soldiers were summoned by name before the military tribunes. They swore the oath of allegiance to Publius Scipio, and each was paid as his name was called. With that, the mutiny of the troops that began at Sucro came to an end. 30. During this same period, Mago's lieutenant Hanno, who had been sent out from Gades by Mago with a small detachment of African troops, had put under arms with the inducement of pay some 4,000 young Spaniards in the area of the river Baetis. After that, he saw his camp taken from him by Lucius Marcius, and, in the turmoil of its capture, he lost most of his men, though there were losses incurred in the flight, too, when the Roman cavalry gave chase to the scattered fugitives. Hanno himself made good his escape with a handful of men. In the course of these events, at the river Baetis, Laelius sailed through the straits into the Atlantic Ocean and put in with his fleet at Cartea. A city that lies on the Atlantic coast at the point where the sea starts to open out after the Narrows. Laelius had, as was noted above, entertained the hope of taking control of Gades through surrender and without a fight, and men actually came to the Roman camp of their own accord to make such a promise. However, the plot to betray the town came to light prematurely, and Mago arrested all involved and delivered them to the praetor Adherbal for removal to Carthage. Adherbal put the conspirators aboard a quinquereme, which he sent on ahead because it was slower than a trireme. He then followed a short distance behind with great triremes. Just when the quinquereme was entering the straits, Laelius, who was himself in a quinquereme, came sailing out of the harbor of Cartea at the head of 7 triremes. He made straight for Adherbal and his triremes, firmly convinced that the Carthaginian quinquereme, already caught up in the rapid waters of the strait, could not be brought back against the tide. Faced with the sudden turn of events, the Carthaginian momentarily panicked, unsure whether to follow his quinquereme or swing round his prows to face the enemy. That very moment of hesitation robbed him of the option of declining battle, for now the Carthaginians were within weapon range and under enemy pressure on every side. In addition, the tide had removed all means of effectively steering the ships. It did not even look like a naval battle. There was no choice of movement and no skill or tactics. The natural character of the strait and its tide took complete control of the entire struggle, bringing the combatants into collision with their own as well as the others' side vessels. As they The natural character of the strait and its tide took complete control of the entire struggle, bringing the combatants into collision with their own as well as the others' sides vessels as they vainly attempted to row in the other direction. The result was that one could see a ship that was in flight spun round by a swirl of water and carried against the victors, and one in pursuit turning as if to flee, if it hit a contrary current. In the battle proper, a ship would be trying to ram an enemy vessel with its beak, only to be turned at an angle and be rammed itself by the other's beak. And another, presented broadside onto the enemy, would suddenly spin round to charge prow on. But while the battle of the triremes fluctuated, since chance was in control of it, the Roman quinquereme was either more stable because of her weight, or else was the more easily managed because she had more banks of oars cutting the churning waters, and she sank 2 triremes, and sheared the oars off one side of a third, as she charged by. She would have wrecked all the others she overtook, had not Hannibal raised the sails and made it across to Africa with his 5 remaining ships. 31. The victorious Laelius returned to Cartea. There he was told of events at Gades, how the plot had been exposed and the conspirators sent off to Carthage, frustrating the hopes with which they had come to him. Laelius then sent a message to Lucius Marcius to tell him they should return to their commander-in-chief if they did not wish to waste time sitting before Gades. Marcius agreed, and they both returned to New Carthage a few days later. With their departure, Mago now had a respite from the pressure of facing a twofold threat from land and sea, and in addition, when he heard about the uprising of the Ilergetes, he conceived a hope of recovering Spain. He therefore sent messengers off to the Senate in Carthage to give an exaggerated account of the mutiny in the Roman camp, as well as of the uprising of the allies, and to urge the senators to send reinforcements so that their Spanish Empire, the legacy of their fathers, could be regained. Mandonius and Indibulus, who had withdrawn to their lands for a time, remained inactive, anxiously awaiting a reliable report of the decisions taken with regard to the mutiny. They were confident that if Roman citizens were pardoned for their wrongdoing, then they, too, could be granted a pardon. When word spread of the severity of the punishment, however, they felt that their own transgression would rate a similar penalty. And so, recalling their countrymen to arms and assembling the auxiliary forces they had had earlier, they took 20,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry and crossed into the territory of the Sedentini. And so, recalling their countrymen to arms and assembling the auxiliary forces they had had earlier, they took 20,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry and crossed into the territory of the Sedentini, where they had maintained a base camp at the start of their insurrection. One more time. And so, recalling their countrymen to arms and assembling the auxiliary forces they had had earlier, they took 20,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry and crossed into the territory of the Sedentini, where they had maintained a base camp at the start of their insurrection. 32. By scrupulously paying all of the men, guilty and innocent alike, and by his conciliatory demeanor and language towards them all, Scipio easily regained his soldiers' goodwill. Before moving camp from New Carthage, he called an assembly and delivered a lengthy tirade against the treachery of the insurgent chieftains. His feelings as he was setting off to punish that villainy could not be compared with those he had when he recently corrected his compatriots. Misdeed, he declared. Then it had been like cutting out his own guts, he said, when with sighs and tears he had taken the lives of 30 men to atone for the folly, or the guilt of 8,000. But now he was happily and confidently proceeding to the massacre of the Ilergetes. For the Ilergetes were not born in the same land as he, nor was there any treaty binding them to him. The only ties they had with him, those of loyalty and friendship, they had themselves broken by their crime. In his army, he said, he could see men who were all citizens, allies, and Latins. But in addition to that, he was also very moved to see that there was barely a single soldier who had not been brought from Italy either by his uncle Gnaeus Scipio, the first Roman to have come to the province, or by his father, the consul, or by himself. So all were now used to the name and the authority of the Scipios, and he wanted to take them back with him for a well-earned triumph in Italy. And he hoped that they would support his candidacy for the consulship, and consider that to be an honor that would be conferred on all of them alike. As for the operation that lay before them, he continued, anyone who considered that to be a war was forgetting his own achievements. In fact, in his eyes, Mago was a greater source of worry than the Ilergetes. Mago, who with a handful of men had fled the world, far an island surrounded by the ocean. For in that case, at least, they faced a Carthaginian leader and a Punic force, no matter how small. In this one, they faced bandits and bandit leaders. These might have some strength when it came to pillaging their neighbors' fields, burning houses, and stealing cattle, but in regular combat, on the battlefield, they had none. In the fight, they would rely more on speed in flight than on their weapons. So it was not because he saw in them any danger or the seeds of a greater conflict that he had decided to crush the Ilergetes before leaving his province. No, it was first of all so that such an unconscionable uprising not remain unpunished, and secondly, so that it could not be said that any foe still remained in a province so thoroughly brought to heel by great courage and good fortune. Accordingly, they should, with the gods' assistance, follow him not to wage war, for this was not a fight against an enemy that was a match for them, but to make criminals pay for their crime. 33. After addressing them like this, Scipio dismissed the men and ordered them to prepare to march the following day. 10 days after leaving New Carthage, he reached the river Ebro. He crossed the river, and 3 days later pitched camp within sight of the enemy. Before him lay a plain ringed by mountains. Scipio now ordered some cattle, most of them taken from the enemy's own fields, to be driven into the valley in order to stimulate the barbarians' savage rapacity, and he sent some light armored men to give them protection. Once the battle had been started with a charge from these light-armed troops, Laelius was under orders from Scipio to launch an attack with his cavalry from a place of concealment. There was a conveniently projecting hill that provided cover for the surprise attack of the cavalry, and so the fight was not delayed. Spotting the cattle in the distance, the Spaniards swooping down on them and the light armored swooped down on the Spaniards while they were busy with their plunder. At first they struck fear into them with their spears. Then, after hurling the light weapons, which could provoke fighting rather than decide the issue, they drew their swords, and the hand-to-hand fighting commenced. It was an evenly matched infantry engagement, and would have remained so but for the arrival of the cavalry. These not only trampled down the men before them with a head-on charge, but some also rode around the foot of the slope, and positioned themselves to the rear of the enemy, cutting off most of them. And so it turned into a greater massacre than is usually the case in skirmishes provoked by such attack. Rather than discourage the barbarians, the reverse infuriated them, and, not to appear demoralized, they formed up for battle at dawn the following day. The terrain was, as noted above, a valley. It was narrow and could not hold all the enemy troops, so that only about two-thirds of the enemy infantry and all their cavalry came into battle. The remainder of the infantry took up a position on the side of the hill. Scipio thought the restricted terrain favored him. A battle at close quarters would better suit the Roman soldier than the Spaniard, and, in addition, the enemy army had been drawn into a location that could not accommodate all his immense forces. He now turned his thoughts to a new strategy. While he could not himself use his cavalry to cover his flanks in such restricted terrain, the enemy, too, could not use the cavalry that they had brought down with their infantrymen. Scipio therefore instructed Laelius to lead the cavalry on a detour over the hills by the most secluded route he could find, and to do his best to separate the cavalry battle from that of the infantry. He then brought all his infantry forces to face the enemy, and established a front of 4 cohorts, because he could not extend the line any further. Scipio lost no time in engaging. He wished to use the battle itself to divert attention from the cavalry going over the hills. The enemy had no idea that the Roman horsemen had been taken on the detour until they heard the clamor of cavalry going into action behind them. And so there were 2 separate battles under way, with 2 infantry lines and 2 cavalry bodies locked in combat down the length of the plain, since the confined space would not permit combined action involving both kinds of fighting. But in the case of the Spaniards, the infantry could be of no assistance to the cavalry, nor the cavalry to the infantry. In addition, the infantry had been deployed unwisely on the level ground through confidence in cavalry support. They were, as a result, cut to pieces. The cavalry, too, who had now been encircled, were unable to resist the enemy foot soldiers before them, for their own infantry had been mown down, nor the enemy cavalry to their rear, though they long resisted from their stationary mounts, whom they formed into a circle. They were killed to a man, and not a single foot or horse soldier fighting in the valley survived. There remained the third of their force that had stood on the hill, where they had a safe view of the engagement without taking part in it. These had both the room and the time for flight. Their chieftains also made good their escape along with them, slipping away in the turmoil before their army could be entirely surrounded. 34. That same day the Spaniards' camp was taken, and apart from the other booty, some 3,000 men were taken as well. About 1,200 Romans and allies fell in that battle, and there were more than 3,000 wounded. The victory would have been less bloody had the battle been fought on a wider plain that offered an easier escape route. Indibilis now abandoned his plans for combat. He felt that, in his predicament, there could be no safer course than an appeal to the integrity and clemency of Scipio, which he had already experienced, and he sent his brother Mandonius to him. Mandonius fell at Scipio's knees and laid the blame for everything on the suicidal lunacy that reigned at the time when not merely the Elergetes and Lecitani, but the Roman camp as well, had been, as it were, infected by some deadly madness. Such was the plight in which he, his brother, and the rest of their people found themselves, he said, that they would return to Publius Scipio, if he felt it appropriate, the lives they had already been granted by him, or, if they were twice spared, they would, in gratitude, for ever dedicate to him, and him alone, the existence that they owed him. Earlier, at a time when they had as yet no experience of the clemency, they had had confidence in their cause, but now they had all their hopes pinned on the compassion of the victor, and none in their cause. The Romans had a long-standing custom in dealing with a people with whom they had had no friendly dealings through treaty or an alliance on terms of equality. They did not accept authority over the people and assume them pacified until they had first surrendered all their possessions, religious and secular, given hostages, been disarmed, and had garrisons established in their cities. Now, when Mandonius was before him, Scipio gave both him and the absent Indibulus a lengthy tongue-lashing, declaring that they really had deserved to die for their transgression, but that, thanks to his own generosity and that of the Roman people, their lives would be spared. In fact, he said, he was not even going to disarm them or demand hostages, since these were safety measures taken by men who feared further uprising. No, he would leave them and free use of their weapons, and set their minds at ease. But if they revolted, he added, he would vent his wrath, not on innocent hostages, but on them themselves, and he would seek retribution not from an unarmed foe, but from one under arms. Now that they had experience of both conditions, he was offering them the choice of enjoying the favor of the Romans or facing their wrath. With that, Mandonius was sent off, and the only demand made of him was for money so the troops could be paid. Scipio then sent Marcius into further Spain, and Silanus to Tarraco. He himself waited a few days for the Elergetes to pay up the entire amount of the money required of them, and then, at the head of a light armed force, caught up with Marcius when he was approaching the ocean. 35. Negotiations with Massinissa had begun some time earlier, but had been delayed on various pretexts because the Numidian wanted at all costs to meet Scipio face to face and ratify their pact by clasping his right hand. That was the explanation for Scipio's long and circuitous journey on this occasion. Massinissa was at Gades when he was informed by Marcius that Scipio was on his way. He began to claim that his horses were degenerating from being penned up on an island, and they were causing a shortage of provisions for everyone else, and themselves suffering from the shortage. In addition, his horsemen were losing their edge through inactivity. In this way he gained Mago's permission to cross to the mainland to conduct raids on the closest Spaniards' farmlands. On landing, Massinissa sent 3 leading Numidians ahead to fix a time and place for talks. He gave the order for 2 of these men to be held back by Scipio as hostages. The third was sent back to conduct Massinissa to the appointed rendezvous, and then the 2 men came to the meeting with a small retinue. Thanks to the fame of Scipio's exploits, the Numidian had already been struck with admiration for the man, and he had formed a mental picture of an imposing and commanding physical presence. But a deeper awe took hold of Massinissa when he saw him in the flesh. Scipio was indeed possessed of great natural dignity, but his flowing locks enhanced it, as did a physical appearance that owed nothing to grooming, but was quite the reverse, that of a real man and a soldier. There was moreover his age, for he was at the height of his powers, which were magnified and highlighted by the bloom of his youth, which seemed to be revived after his illness. The Numidian was practically spellbound when they met. He thanked Scipio for sending back his brother's son. Ever since then, he said, he had been searching for that opportunity which the immortal gods had now finally offered him, and which he had not let slip. His desire now was to devote his energies to Scipio and the Roman people, and in such a way that not a single foreigner would prove to have given greater assistance to the Roman state. He had long been wishing to give such assistance, he said, but he had had less opportunity in Spain, a land that was foreign and unknown to him. However, he would now easily provide it in the land in which he had been born and raised, with the prospect of inheriting his father's throne. He added that, should the Romans send Scipio to Carthage, too, as commander-in-chief, he was quite sure that Carthage would not long last. Scipio was pleased to see and listen to Massinissa. He knew that he represented the true strength of the enemy cavalry force, and the young man also gave clear indications of his mettle. Assurances were exchanged, and Scipio began his return journey to Tarraco. With the consent of the Romans, Massinissa raided the fields in the neighborhood, so that he would appear to have had good reason for crossing to the mainland. He then returned to Gades. 36. Mago now despaired of success in the Spanish theater, hopes for which had been raised first by the soldiers' mutiny and then by Indibilis insurrection. As he prepared to cross for Africa, news reached him from Carthage that he was under orders from the Senate to take to Italy the fleet he had under him at Gades. In Italy, he was to hire as large a force of Gallic and Ligurian warriors as he could, join up with Hannibal, and not allow a campaign that had started with great vigor and even greater success to lose its momentum. Money was shipped to Mago from Carthage for the purpose, and Mago himself wrested as much as he could from the people of Gades. He plundered not only their treasure, but their temples as well, and pressured all private individuals to contribute gold and silver to the public purse. In the course of his journey along the Spanish coast, Mago set ashore some soldiers not far from New Carthage, and raided the farms in the vicinity. He then brought the fleet up to the city. There, after keeping his men on board during the day, he had them disembark at night, and led them to the section of the wall that was responsible for the Roman capture of New Carthage. He felt that the city was not strongly garrisoned, and also that a number of the citizens would rise up in the hope of a change of regime. However, men had come in panic from the countryside with simultaneous reports of the Carthaginian raids, the flight of the farmers, and the approach of the enemy. Furthermore, Mago's fleet had been spotted during the day, and it was becoming clear that his choice of anchorage before the city had not been fortuitous. And so men were deployed with weapons and held in readiness inside the gate that faced the lagoon and the sea. When the enemy, a crowd of sailors interspersed with the soldiers, came up to the walls out of formation and with more commotion than vigor, the gate was suddenly flung open, and the Romans rushed out with a shout. They threw their foe into disorder, drove them back with their very first charge and volley of missiles, and inflicted heavy losses as they pursued them to the shore. In fact, had ships not been brought to land to take the panic-stricken men on board, there would not have been a single survivor from the rout or the battle. There was panic on the ships as well. Men were pulling up ladders, trying to prevent the enemy from charging aboard along with their own fighters, and cutting through hawsers and cables, so there would be no time lost in getting under way. Many met terrible deaths as they swam to the ships, unsure in the darkness of what to head for or what to avoid. The following day, when the fleet had beaten a hasty retreat back to the ocean, whence it had come, some 800 dead men and about 2,000 weapons were found between the wall and the shore. "37. On returning to Gades, Mago found that he was shut out of the town, and instead put in at Simbai, a place not far distant from Gades. He then sent a delegation to protest against the gates being closed to an ally and a friend. The townsmen made the excuse that it had come about because a mob, incensed over some pillaging by the soldiers as they disembarked the ships, had converged on the gates. Mago induced their Sophetes. A Sophete is the chief magistrate amongst the Phoenicians, to come to a meeting along with the town's financial officer, and had them all flogged and crucified. After that, Mago crossed with his ships to Pityusa, an island lying roughly 100 miles from the mainland and then inhabited by Carthaginians. The fleet was thus given a warm welcome and was generously provisioned and also reinforced in terms of fighting men and weaponry. Their confidence bolstered by this assistance, the Carthaginians sailed over to the Balearic Islands, 50 miles from Pityusa. There are two Balearic Islands. One is larger than the other, and better endowed with armaments and fighting men. It also has a harbor, where Mago felt he could spend a comfortable winter, autumn being now at an end. But the fleet was given a reception that was just as hostile as if the island's inhabitants were Romans. Today, slings are the islanders' principal weapon, but in those days they were their only one, and no individual from another race possesses as much skill in their use as any single member of the Balearic peoples. Stones fell like the thickest hail, hurled in such enormous quantities at the fleet as it approached the land, that the Carthaginians, not daring to enter the harbor, instead turned their ships on a course out to sea. They crossed to the smaller island of the Balearians, which was agriculturally fertile, but less well populated and less well armed than the other. Disembarking, they established camp in a well-protected position above the harbor, and then took possession of the city and its farmlands without a fight. They recruited 2,000 auxiliary troops and dispatched them to Carthage, and then drew their vessels ashore for the winter. After Mago's departure from the ocean coastline, the people of Gades capitulated to the Romans. 38. Such were the operations conducted in Spain under Publius Scipio's command and authority. Scipio himself now put the province in the hands of Lucius Lentulus and Lucius Manlius Acidinus, and returned to Rome with 10 ships. He was accorded a meeting with the Senate in the temple of Bellona, outside the city, and there he gave an account of his achievements in Spain. He enumerated his pitched battles and the towns he had taken by force from the enemy, and named the tribes that he had brought under the sway of the Roman people. He had gone to Spain to face 4 commanders and 4 victorious armies, he said, and had left not a single Carthaginian in the land. He then hopefully raised the question of a triumph for these achievements, but he did not pursue the matter earnestly, since it was well known that to that day no man who had not been in office at the moment of his success had ever celebrated a triumph. When the Senate adjourned, Scipio went into the city on foot, where he had 14,342 pounds of silver and a large quantity of coined silver carried before him to the treasury. Lucius Veturius Philo then presided over the consular elections. At these the centuries unanimously and enthusiastically declared Publius Scipio consul, and as his colleague Scipio was given Publius Licinius Crassus, the Pontifex Maximus. It is, in fact, on record that the attendance at these elections exceeded that of any election during the war. People had come together all over not only to vote, but just to get a glimpse of Publius Scipio. They converged in large numbers on his home and on the Capitol, where he was busy with the sacrifice, offering to Jupiter the 100 oxen he had promised in the vow in Spain. Then they silently assured themselves that, just as Gaius Lutatius had finished off the earlier Punic War, so Publius Cornelius would finish off the one that was now upon them. And just as Scipio had completely driven the Carthaginians from Spain, so would he drive them from Italy. They were earmarking Africa as his province, as if the war in Italy were over. The election of the praetors followed. The 2 current plebeian aediles, Spurius Lucretius and Gnaeus Octavius, were duly elected, and from candidates then holding no office, Gnaeus Servilius Capio and Lucius Aemilius Papus. Publius Cornelius Scipio and Publius Licinius Crassus began their consulship in the 14th year of the Punic War. In the allocation of provinces, Sicily came to Scipio without sortition and with his colleagues' approval. Crassus was Pontifex Maximus, and his religious duties obliged him to remain in Italy, and Bruttium was then assigned to Crassus. After that, the Praetorian provinces were assigned by sortition. The city jurisdiction came to Gnaeus Servilius, Ariminum, as Gaul, as then designated, to Spurius Lucretius Sicily, to Lucius Aemilius and Sardinia to Gnaeus Octavius. A meeting of the Senate was held on the Capitol. Here a senatorial decree was passed, on a motion from Publius Scipio, authorizing Scipio to put on the games he had vowed during the mutiny of the troops in Spain, and to finance them out of the moneys he had himself deposited in the treasury. 39. After that, Scipio brought before the Senate some spokesmen of the people of Saguntum, and the eldest made the following address. Senators, while no misfortune can exceed what we have endured in our determination to maintain to the very last our loyalty to you, your services and those of your generals towards us have been such that we do not regret the calamities we have suffered. You undertook a war for our sakes, and having undertaken it, you have prosecuted it for 13 years. And with such tenacity that you have yourselves faced, and made the Carthaginian people face, the most dire of predicaments. In Italy you had a terrible war on your hands, and Hannibal as your enemy, and yet you sent a consul into Spain at the head of an army to gather together the debris, one might say, or of wreck. From the moment they arrived in the province, Publius and Gnaeus Cornelius never stopped doing whatever would help us and harm our enemies. First of all, they restored our city to us. They sent men throughout Spain to search for our citizens who had been sold into slavery, and, delivering them from servitude, gave them back their freedom. We were on the verge of exchanging the most miserable lot for one that was desirable when your generals Publius and Gnaeus Cornelius perished, an event that brought almost more sorrow to us than it did to you. At that point we truly thought that we had been returned to our ancient homeland from faraway places, only to face ruin once more and to see a second destruction of our native city. And we thought we certainly needed no Carthaginian general or Carthaginian army to bring about our undoing. We could be exterminated by the Turduli, our oldest enemies, who had also been to blame for our earlier destruction. Then suddenly, and to make our surprise, you sent us Publius Scipio here, seeing whom makes us think ourselves the most fortunate of all the people of Saguntum, for we have seen him declared consul, the man who is our hope, our succor, our salvation, and we shall be reporting that sight to our fellow citizens. He captured a large number of our enemies' towns in Spain, and in every case he set the Saguntines apart from the mass of prisoners and sent them home. Finally, there was Turdetania, so implacably to us that Saguntum could not survive while that race of people remained intact. Scipio inflicted such a crushing defeat to them that not only do we ourselves have no reason to fear them, but, if I may be forgiven for saying so, even our descendants do not either. We see in ruins the city of the people for whose gratification Hannibal had destroyed, Saguntum, and we take from their lands a tax, the income from which pleases us, but not us much as the revenge it represents. We could not have hoped or wished for more than this from the immortal gods, and the Senate and the people of Saguntum have sent us to you as a 10-man delegation to thank you. We are, at the same time, to congratulate you on your conduct of affairs in Spain and Italy over these years. Thanks to this, you now have Spain militarily under your control, not just as far as the river Ebro, but to where the ocean marks the ends of the earth. And of Italy you have left the Carthaginian nothing but the area enclosed by the rampart of his camp. We have been instructed not only to offer thanks for this to Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, protector of the Capitoline citadel, but also, with your permission, to bear to the Capitol this gift of a golden wreath to commemorate your victory. We request your permission to do this, and request also, if you think it appropriate, that you ratify and, by your authority, make permanent the benefits your generals have conferred on us. Responding to the Saguntan delegation, the Senate declared that the destruction and subsequent rebuilding of Saguntum would remain an illustration to the whole world of the loyalty between allies that both had maintained. Their generals' actions in restoring Saguntum and delivering Saguntum citizens from servitude had been correct and appropriate, and in accordance with the will of the Senate, and all the other benefits the generals had conferred on them had been approved by the Senate. The senators added that they accorded the delegates permission to place their gift on the Capitol orders or on the Capitol. The senators added that they accorded the delegates permission to place their gift on the Capitol. Orders were then issued for the delegates to be provided with accommodation and hospitality, and for a gift of not less than 10,000 aces to be presented to each of them. The other delegations were then brought before the Senate and granted an audience. The delegates from Saguntum requested permission to make a journey to see as much of Italy as they could in safety, and for this they were given guides, and letters were dispatched to the various towns with instructions that they give the Spaniards a warm welcome. There followed discussion of state policy, the raising of legions, and the distribution of provinces. 40. It was now common gossip that Africa had been set aside as Publius Scipio's new province, without recourse or sortition, and Scipio himself, no longer satisfied with the modicum of fame, would say that he had been declared consul not simply to conduct the war, but to finish it. And he said there was no way of achieving that end other than by his personally transporting the army to Africa, and if the Senate opposed him, he would quite openly declare he would achieve his end through the vote of the people. This project found no favor at all with the most prominent senators, but all of them, from fear of self-interest, held their tongues. All, that is, except Quintus Fabius Maximus. When asked his opinion, Fabius spoke as follows. I realize, senators, that many of you think that what is under discussion today is a matter already decided, and that anyone who voices an opinion on Africa as an assignment on the assumption that it is still open for debate will be wasting his breath. But personally, I cannot, in the first place, see how Africa is firmly established as the responsibility of our brave and stalwart consul, when the Senate has not resolved, nor the people authorized, that it be an official assignment for the coming year. Secondly, if it is an official assignment, then I do not think any fault lies with a senator who, in his turn, states his opinion on a matter under discussion, but rather with the consul who makes a mockery of the Senate by pretending to bring up as business a matter already settled. And yet I am quite sure that when I oppose this mad rush to cross to Africa, two things are sure to be thought of me. The first is that I have an inherent tendency to delay. Young men are welcome to call this fear or lethargy, as long as I can feel no regret that other people's strategy inevitably appears more appealing at first sight. but mine proves better in practice. The second thing is that I am spitefully critical and jealous of the gallant consul's celebrity that is increasing with every passing day. To check any suspicion of this, I can cite the life I have lived, my character, and my dictatorship, plus 5 terms as consul, along with so much glory earned in battle and in domestic affairs, that I am more tired than desirous of it. If this does not defend me against such suspicion, then at least my age entirely frees me from it. For how can I be in competition with a man who is not even as old as my son? When I was dictator, when I was still full of vigor and in the process of achieving great things, I was vilified by my master of horse. But nobody, either in the Senate or before the people, heard me raise any objection to the man's authority being made equal to mine. Something unheard of up to that point. The man was in certain people's judgment on the same level as me, and I preferred to have actions, not words, bring him in short order to acknowledge freely that I was his superior. And now that I have held the offices of state, I am certainly not going to set myself in competition and rivalry with a young man in his prime. And for what? To have Africa assigned to me as an area of responsibility if he is refused it? Of course, when I am now weary, not just of public career, but simply of life, I must live and must die with the glory that I have achieved. I prevented Hannibal's victory, so that victory over him could go to you, who now have the strength to win it. '41. It will be only fair for you to forgive me one thing, Publius Cornelius. In my own character, I never set what people thought of me above the interest of the state, and so I shall not put your glory ahead of the public good either. It would be different if there remained a struggle in Italy, or if the enemy were such that there was no glory to be won from this defeat. In that case, the main holding you back in Italy, even though you were doing that for the public good, might be regarded as having taken steps to remove, along with the war, the possibility of your winning glory. But Hannibal is an enemy who has been occupying Italy for 13 years with an army that still remains intact. Will you, Publius Cornelius, be displeased with your renown if, as consul, you drive from Italy the enemy who has caused us so many funerals and so many defeats, and if you win distinction for finishing this war, as Gaius Lutatius did for finishing the First Punic War? Will you, Publius Cornelius, be displeased with your renown if, as consul, you drive from Italy the enemy who has caused us so many funerals and so many defeats, and if you win distinction for finishing this war, as Gaius Lutatius did for finishing the First Punic War? Unless, that is, Hamilcar is to be regarded as a better commander than Hannibal, or that war as being more important than this, or unless that victory is greater and more glorious than this one is going to be, provided that it falls to us to triumph during your consulship. Which would you prefer? To have pulled Hamilcar away from Drepana or Eryx, or to have driven the Carthaginians and Hannibal from Italy? Although you cherish glory already acquired more than glory you hope to acquire, not even you would take greater pride in having freed Spain rather than Italy from the war. Hannibal has not yet reached the stage that anyone who chose another theater of war would not be thought to have feared him rather than to have despised him. Hannibal has not yet reached the stage that anyone who chose another theater of war would not be thought to have feared him rather than to have despised him. So why not get yourself ready for this effort? If your goal is the supreme glory of finishing off the Punic War, why not go straight from here and focus hostilities where Hannibal is located? Why not do that rather than take the circuitous route you propose of crossing to Africa and hoping that Hannibal will follow you there? It is also the natural way of doing things. You defend what is yours before you go on to attack what belongs to others. Let there be peace in Italy before there is a war in Africa, and let us be rid of fear ourselves before we go on to inspire it in others. If both things can be achieved under your leadership and authority, then go on to storm Carthage over there after you have vanquished Hannibal here. If one of the two victories has to be left to fresh consuls, the earlier one will turn out to be the greater and more famous, as well as being the cause of the second. Set aside the fact that the treasury cannot support two armies operating independently in Italy and in Africa, and set aside the fact that we are left with no reserves from which to keep our fleets maintained and to provide supplies. Even apart from that, everyone is aware of the huge risk involved. Publius Licinius will be fighting the war in Italy, Publius Scipio in Africa. Suppose Hannibal emerges victorious and proceeds to march on Rome. I pray that all the gods avert the omen, and my heart shudders at the mere mention of it. But what has happened once can happen again. Is that the point at which we finally call you back from Africa? You, the consul, just as we recalled Quintus Fulvius from Capua? And what if it turns out that the fortunes of war are evenly divided in Africa too? Your own family should be a warning to you. Your father and uncle cut down with their armies within 30 days of each other, and that after they had, by their magnificent achievements on land and sea over a number of years, added great lustre to the name of the Roman people and to your family amongst foreign races, I should run out of daylight if I tried to list the kings and commanders who brought terrible defeats on their armies through ill-considered invasions of enemy lands. The normally prudent state of Athens quit its war at home to cross to Sicily with a large fleet, on the advice of a young man whose energy was as impressive as his noble birth. In a single naval battle, they inflicted abiding damage on their own prosperous community back home. "42. But my examples are from abroad and too distant in time. Let us take as an illustration Africa, now under discussion, and Marcus Attilius, which provide a famous example of fortune cutting both ways. When you catch sight of Africa from the sea, Publius Cornelius, you will certainly think your assignments in Spain to have been child's play. For what similarity is there between the two? Your journey was over a pacified stretch of water along the coastline of Italy and Gaul, putting in at the allied city of Emporia. Disembarking your men, you led them to allies and friends of the Roman people in Tarraco, going through lands that were all perfectly safe. Then after Tarraco, your route lay through Roman military positions. In the neighborhood of the river Ebro were armies of your father and uncle, and after the loss of their commanders, these, by virtue of that very tragedy, were all the more ready for the fray. Their leader was the well-known Lucius Marcius. True, his was an irregular appointment, and he was chosen to meet the needs of the movement by the vote of the soldiers. But while the famous generals had birth and regular state of offices to commend them, he was their peer in the whole gamut of military skills. The attack on New Carthage proceeded at a very easy pace, and none of the three Punic armies came to defend their allies. As for everything else, and I do not belittle it, it simply is not to be compared with the war in Africa. There we have had no harbor open to our shipping, no territory that has been brought to heel, no allied state, no friendly king, no place to establish a bridgehead, and no way to advance. Wherever you look, all is hostile and threatening. Are you relying on Sfax and the Numidians? It should be enough to have rallied. It should be enough to have relied on them once. Hasty action is not always successful, and treachery attempts to win confidence in minor affairs, so that, when the stakes are high, the duplicity is well rewarded. The enemy brought down your father and uncle in battle, but not before the Celtibrian allies had done so with their treachery. And you yourself did not face as much danger from Mago and Hasdrubal as you did from Indibilis and Mendonius, whose allegiance you had accepted. Having experienced a mutiny of your own soldiers, do you think you can trust Numidians? Sfax and Massinissa both want to see themselves rather than the Carthaginians supreme in Africa, but after them the Carthaginians rather than any one else. At the moment, the rivalry between them and all manner of inducements to conflict are stimulating them, because the threat from without is far removed. Show them Roman arms and a foreign army, and you will have them rushing together to put out what they consider to be fire engulfing them all. The Carthaginians defended Spain in one manner, but it is in another that they will defend the battlements of their native city, the temples of their gods, their altars, and their homes, when the fearful wife sees them off to battle, and little children come running before their feet. Just suppose that the Carthaginians have enough confidence in a united Africa, in the loyalty of the kings allied to them, and in their own fortifications. Suppose they actually send a new army from Africa into Italy, when they see the country divested of the protection supplied by you and your army. Or suppose that they order Mago to join up with Hannibal, for it is known that Mago has left the Balearics with his fleet, and is skirting the coastline of the Ligurian Alps. Naturally, we shall find ourselves in the same frightful situation that we were in recently, when Hasdrubal descended on Italy. And you let Hasdrubal slip through your fingers into Italy, you who are going to quarantine not just Carthage, but the whole of Africa with your army. He had been defeated by you, you will say, all the more reason for me to wish, as much for your sake as the country's, that a defeated man had not been allowed passage into Italy. Allow me to credit your strategy with all that turned out well for you and for the empire of the Roman people, and to blame all that turned out badly on the shifting fortunes of war and on bad luck. The fact is that the better and braver you are, the more your native city and all Italy wants to hold on to such a protector. And you yourself cannot conceal the truth that wherever Hannibal is to be found, that is the center and hub of this war. For you declare that your reason for crossing to Africa is to draw Hannibal there with you. So whether it be here or over there, it is with Hannibal that your fight will be. Are you then going to be stronger on your own in Africa, or here with your army joined to that of your colleague? Does not the recent example of Claudius and Livius also serve to illustrate how important a difference that makes? And what I ask you is going to make Hannibal stronger in terms of arms and personnel. And what I ask you is going to make Hannibal stronger in terms of arms and personnel. Being in a remote corner of Bruttian territory, where he has long been vainly appealing for reinforcements from home, or having Carthage close by with all of Africa allied to her, what sort of idea is this to want to decide the issue where your forces are halved and your enemies much greater, instead of where your two armies are to be fighting against one, and one worn down by so many battles and such long and arduous service? Keep in mind the contrast between your strategy and your father's. As consul, he left for Spain in order to encounter Hannibal when he came down from the Alps. But then he returned to Italy from that assignment. When Hannibal is in Italy, you are preparing to leave the country, not because you think it serves the interest of the state, but because you think it will promote your reputation and glory. It was the same when you left your province and your army without legal authority, and without the sanction of a senatorial decree. A commander of the people of Rome, you entrusted to 2 ships the fortunes of the state and the majesty of our empire, the safety of which was staked on your life. My own opinion, senators, is that Publius Scipio has been elected consul not to serve his own personal interest, but to serve the Republic and us. And I think that the armies have been raised for the protection of the city and Italy, not for consuls to take over to any part of the world they choose with king-like arrogance. 43. The address was appropriate to the situation, and Fabius also had personal authority and a reputation for his inveterate sagacity. He therefore impressed most of the Senate, especially the senior members, and more people appreciated the older man's discretion than the younger's impetuous spirit. Then Scipio is said to have delivered the following speech. Senators, Quintus Fabius himself allowed at the beginning of this address that he might be suspected of spiteful criticism in presenting his opinion. I would not myself presume to make such a charge against so great a man, but such a suspicion has not been entirely erased, whether the problem lies in how he has presented his case or in the facts themselves. For in his attempt to smother any charge of envy, he has been extremely fulsome in his praise for his own political career and famous exploits. It is as if the competition I risk facing must come from the lowest sort of people, and not from him, because he towers above everybody, and I do not conceal my attempts to rise so far myself. He would not countenance my being considered on his level. He has represented himself as an old man who has finished his career, and me as being younger even than his own son. The assumption is that thirst for glory is coterminous with human life, and that the most important element of it is not concerned with how we are remembered by posterity. I am certain that it is the case with all great souls that they compare themselves not only with men of the present, but with the luminaries of every age. I certainly do not hide my desire not only to achieve your renown, Quintus Fabius, but, if you'll forgive me for saying so, even to surpass it, if I can. Your attitude towards me and mine towards my juniors should not be such that we are unwilling to see any citizen achieve success similar to ours. For that would hurt not only those who are the objects of our envy, but the state as well, and almost the entire human race. Fabius expanded on the danger I would face in crossing to Africa, to the point of making me think that he was worried not just about the Republic and our army, but about me personally. How did this sudden concern for me come about? Remember when my father and uncle were killed? When two of their armies had been practically exterminated? When the Spanish provinces were lost, and 4 Carthaginian armies and 4 commanders held the whole country in fear of their armed might? Remember how a general was sought for that war, and nobody put himself forward apart from me? How nobody dared submit his name, and how the Roman people conferred that command on me when I was 24 years old? Why was it that no one at that moment made any mention of my age, of the enemy's strength, of the difficulty of the war, or of the recent defeat of my father and my uncle? Has there now been some greater debacle in Africa than there was at the time in Spain? Are there now greater armies in Africa and more and better commanders than there were in Spain at the time? Did I have greater maturity for conducting the war than I have now? Is Spain a more appropriate theater for war with the Carthaginian enemy than Africa? 4 Punic armies were defeated and put to flight. Many cities were stormed to frightened into submission. The whole country was subdued as far as the ocean. Along with it, droves of chieftains and barbarous tribes. All of Spain was recovered, with no trace of war left behind. After that, it is easy to make light of what I have done, as easy indeed as to make light, if I return victorious from Africa, of those very things that are now being exaggerated and made to seem horrific, just to hold me back. Fabius says we have no access to Africa, that no harbors are open to us. He talks about Marcus Attilius' capture in Africa, suggesting that Marcus Attilius ran into trouble on first reaching the country. He does not remember either that the ill-starred commander did find African ports open to him, and that he fought a splendid campaign in his first year, and in the eyes of the Carthaginian military leaders remained unbeaten to the end. So you will have no success browbeating me with that particular example. If that defeat had been sustained in this war, not the first one, recently and not 40 years ago, why would I have less justification for crossing to Africa after Regulus' capture than for crossing to Spain after the Scipios fell into battle? I would not allow that the Spartan Xanthippus was born to be a greater blessing to Carthage than I would be for my own country, and my confidence would only increase from knowing that so much importance can lie in the courage of one individual. But we also have to hear about the Athenians and how they made their reckless crossing to Sicily, neglecting the war at home. Now, since you have the time for Greek stories, why not rather tell of Agathocles, king of Syracuse? When Sicily had long been aflame with a war with Carthage, he crossed to this same Africa and threw the war back to the source from which it had come. 44. But what is the point of using dated and foreign examples to illustrate how effective it is to take the offensive, to intimidate the enemy, and removing the threat from oneself to expose another to danger? Can there be a more important and more contemporary example than Hannibal? Pillaging other people's territory is very different from seeing your own torched and destroyed, and the aggressor has more spirit than the one fighting off the threat. In addition, there is the fear of the unknown, but as the invader, you see up close the enemy's pluses and minuses. Hannibal had not expected to see so many peoples in Italy defect to him, and it was after the defeat at Cannae that they did so. How much less security and stability could the Carthaginians expect to find in Africa, faithless allies and domineering and arrogant masters as they are? In addition, even though we were abandoned by our allies, we still held out by virtue of our own strength, the Roman soldier. The Carthaginian has no might in his citizenry, using as he does African and Numidian mercenaries, intrinsically capricious people prone to switching allegiance. In this case, as long as there is no hesitation on our part, you will at one and the same time receive word that I have made the crossing, that Africa is aflame with war, and Hannibal is making his way out of the country, and that Carthage is under siege. You may expect more encouraging and more frequent reports from Africa than you used to receive from Spain. Such hopes are raised in me by the fortune of the Roman people, by the gods who are witnesses to the treaty and enemy broke, and by the kings Fax and Massinissa, on whose loyalty I shall rely, while also ensuring that I am well protected against duplicity. Many factors that the distance now renders unclear the war will clarify, and the mark of a soldier and a leader is not to miss any opportunity that presents itself, and to put to strategic use what he is offered by chance. Quintus Fabius, I shall have the adversary you tender. Hannibal, that is. But let me draw him after me, rather than have him hold me here. Let me force him to fight in his own country, and Carthage, rather than some crumbling Bruttian forts, will be the prize of victory. And there is no question of the state suffering damage here while I make the crossing, set my army ashore in Africa, and advance my camp in the direction of Carthage. You were able to assure that Quintus Fabius, when the victorious Hannibal flitted around all Italy, and you should avoid the insulting suggestion that the consul Publius Licinius, a man of great courage, cannot assure it now, when Hannibal has already been badly shaken, and is all but spent. And the reason for Licinius not participating in a sortition for such a distant province was simply so that the Pontifex Maximus should not be absent from his religious duties. But let us suppose, for heaven's sake, that the war were not brought to an end any earlier by the strategy I am advocating. Even then, being seen to have the courage not only to defend Italy, but also to conduct an offensive against Africa, would be in keeping with the dignity of the Roman people and their reputation amongst kings and nations of foreign lands. It is important, too, to avoid having it believed and spread abroad that no Roman commander would dare to do what Hannibal dared to do, and that whereas in the first Punic War, when the fight was for Sicily, Africa was frequently attacked by our armies and fleets. Now, when the fight is for Italy, she is left in peace. Italy has been tormented for so long. Let her finally have some rest and let Africa have her turn of burning and devastation. Let us have a Roman camp threaten Carthage's gates, rather than once more see the enemy rampart from our own walls. Let Africa be the theater for the remainder of the war. It is to that country that the terror, the flight, the pillaging of fields should be diverted, and the defection of allies and the other military disasters that have descended on us over a 14-year period. I have said enough about the interests of the state, the campaign now facing us, and the areas of responsibility in question. It would have to be a long speech irrelevant to our concerns, if I wished to disparage Quintus Fabius's fine reputation and boost my own, just as he belittled my achievements in Spain. I shall do neither, members of the Senate, and then, if nothing else, the younger man will at least have surpassed the older in curbing and restraining his language. My life and achievements have been such that I am quite happy to hold my tongue and live with the opinion you have independently formed of them. 45. Scipio's address was less favorably received. Word had not got round that, if he failed in the Senate to have Africa assigned to him as his area of responsibility, he would immediately bring a proposal before the people. And so Quintus Fulvius, who had held 4 consulships and had also been censor, demanded of the consul that he make a clear statement before the Senate. Would he leave it to the senators to determine the areas of responsibility and accept their decision, or would he take the matter to the people? When Scipio replied that he would do whatever served the interest of the state, Fulvius said, "Then I put that question to you. I was not unaware what your reply and what your reaction would be. For you make it clear that you are sounding out the Senate rather than consulting it, and that if we do not immediately vote you the assignment you want, you have a proposal for the people already drawn up. Accordingly, tribunes of the plebs, I earnestly request that you stand by me when I refuse my opinion. For even if the division favors my proposal, the consul is not going to accept it as binding." And with that, wrangling broke out, because the consul claimed it was unconstitutional for the tribunes to intervene in support of any senator refusing to state his opinion when asked to do so in his turn. The tribunes then delivered the following judgment: if the consul permits the Senate to decide on the assignment of responsibilities, it is our wish that the decision of the Senate be binding, and we shall not allow the matter to be brought before the people. If the consul does not so permit, we shall support a person refusing to voice his opinion on the matter. The consul requested a day to discuss the issue with the colleague, and the following day the Senate had his permission. The areas of responsibility were assigned as follows. One of the consuls received Sicily, together with the 30 warships, and Gaius Servilius had commanded the areas of responsibility were assigned as follows. One of the consuls received Sicily, together with the 30 warships that Gaius Servilius had commanded the year before. That consul was also given leave to cross Africa if he felt it to be in the interest of the state. The other was given Bruttium and the war against Hannibal with his own choice of army. Lucius Veturius and Quintus Caecilius were to decide by sortition, or by mutual agreement, which of the two was to continue operations in Bruttium, and the 2 legions that the consul would leave there. The one given that assignment would have his imperium extended for a year. All others who were to take charge of armies and hold official responsibilities, apart from the consuls and praetors, also had their imperium extended. It fell to Quintus Caecilius by sortition to join the consul for the war against Hannibal in Bruttium. The games vowed by Scipio were then put on, with large crowds of enthusiastic spectators in attendance. Marcus Pomponius Matho and Quintus Catius were sent on a mission to Delphi to take a gift from the spoils of Hannibal. They bore a golden crown weighing 200 pounds and reproductions of the spoils made from 1,000 pounds of silver. Scipio had not been granted a request to levy troops, but he had not been particularly insistent either. He did, however, secure authorization to take volunteers with him, and because he had stated that the fleet would not involve state expense, to receive all allied contributions for the construction of new ships, the various peoples of Etruria were first to commit to helping the consul, according to the means of each. The people of Caere promised grain for the crews and all manner of provisions. Populonia promised iron, Tarquini sail linen, and Volaterrae wax caulking for ships, and grain. Arretium made a commitment of 3,000 shields, and as many helmets, and also a total of 40,000 javelins, Gallic spears, and long pikes in equal numbers. It would also supply axes, shovels, scythes, basins, and grinders sufficient for 40 warships, as well as 120,000 measures of grain, and a contribution towards the upkeep of naval officers and oarsmen. Perusia, Clusium, and Rossalae made a commitment of fur for the construction of ships, and a large quantity of grain. Scipio also availed himself of fur from the state-owned forest. The peoples of Umbria promised to supply fighting men, as did those of Nursia, Riat, Amiternum, and the entire Sabine area. Large numbers of Marsi, Peligni, and Marrucini gave their names as volunteers for the fleet. The people of Camerinum, who had a treaty with Rome, based on equal rights, sent an armed contingent of 600 men. Keels were laid down for 40 ships. Keels were laid down for 30 ships, 20 quinqueremes, and 10 quadriremes. Such was the determination with which Scipio then attacked the work that the vessels were launched, fully equipped and rigged 44 days after the timber had been taken from the woods. 46. Setting aboard approximately 7,000 volunteer soldiers, Scipio left for Sicily with 30 warships, and Publius Licinius came to the 2 consular armies in Bruttium. Of these armies, Licinius took 4 himself, and 1 that Lucius Veturius had led as consul, leaving Metellus in charge of the legions, which he had already commanded, for he thought that Metellus would find it easier to operate with men accustomed to his authority. The praetors also left for their various spheres of duty. Since the war was facing a financial deficit, the quaestors were instructed to sell off an area of Capuan farmland between the Fossa Graeca and the coast. Moreover, people were allowed to lay information about lands that had belonged to any companion citizen, so that it could become the property of the Roman people. The informer's reward was fixed at a tenth of the value of the land about which he had provided the information. Furthermore, the urban praetor Gnaeus Servilius was assigned the task of ensuring that citizens of the Capua settled only where they were allowed to do so by the senatorial decree, and of punishing those residing elsewhere. The same summer, Mago, son of Hamilcar, put a force of hand-picked fighting men aboard his fleet and crossed to Italy from the smaller of the Balearic Islands, where he had spent the winter. He brought with him 11,000 infantry and roughly 2,000 cavalry on about 30 men of war and numerous freighters, and thanks to the speed of his arrival, he captured Genoa, where there were no troops patrolling the coastline. Mago next landed on the shores of the Ligurian Alps. Mago next landed on the shores of the Ligurian Alps, hoping to create some unrest in the area. The Ingeuni, a Ligurian tribe, were at the time engaged in a war with the Epanteri Montani. The Carthaginian, therefore, deposited his booty in the Alpine town of Savo, and, leaving 10 warships riding at anchor there to protect it, sent the rest of the warships to Carthage for the defense of the coast there, for there was talk that Scipio would be crossing over. Mago then struck a treaty with the Ingani, preferring to have their support than their adversaries, and proceeded to launch an offensive against the Montani. His army was day by day on the increase, as Gauls flocked to him from every direction, drawn by the fame of his name. This caused the senators great concern when they learned of it from dispatches sent by Spurius Lucretius. They feared that, should there be another war of similar proportions in that area, with only the enemy leader changed, then their joy, 2 years earlier, when Hasdrubal and his army were wiped out, might prove to have been unfounded. They therefore instructed the proconsul Marcus Livius to move his army of slave volunteers from Etruria up to Ariminum. In addition, the praetor Gnaeus Servilius was instructed to have the 2 city legions put under the command of a man of his choosing, if he thought this to be in the interest of the state, and brought from the city. Marcus Valerius Lavinus led those legions to Arretium. In that same period, about 80 Carthaginian freighters were captured off Sardinia by Gnaeus Octavius, who had charge of that province. Coelius claims that their cargo was grain and other provisions destined for Hannibal. Valerius, that they were taken as they were transporting to Carthage plunder from Etruria, and Ligurian and Montanian prisoners of war. In Bruttium, nothing of any significance occurred that year. A plague had fallen on the Romans and the Carthaginians, hurting both sides equally, though the Carthaginian was afflicted with food shortages as well as the disease. Hannibal spent the summer in the area of the temple of Juno Lacinian. There he built and dedicated an altar, adding a large inscription written in both Punic and Greek, which listed his achievements. End of book 28.